you know this, maybe, but I'm actually home. I'm from the North Shore, as we all call it. But I've been in Toronto for a very long time. But it's so nice to be back in New Brunswick. This is really lovely. I haven't been to Fredericton very much in my life, though, just a few times. I mostly stay in the north or Elsie Buktuk or St. John's. These are where I have my peoples. And we still have, maybe it's the lights that need to go off. And then it should go.
I can zoom.
Are you guys okay?
We'll be fine.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. All right, cool. I was saying earlier, actually, before we left the hotel, that used to be very, very easy for me to just stand here and talk about all kinds of stuff for like a couple of hours, right? Not a problem. Now, though, not only do I have to write notes about what I'm going to talk about, I have to write them in great big font. There are some things about aging that I don't appreciate. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is, within the context of social work in general, in the country of Canada, obviously, I'm going to offer, kind of like what you did, actually, I think 3 different pieces. So I'm going to walk us through very briefly an emphasis on Indigenous, on where Indigenous peoples have been, where we are now, and what the future hopes are. So first I'm going to highlight a few things around how Indigenous peoples have looked at the world, understood the world before colonization. And then I'm going to talk about colonization and its current impacts on Indigenous peoples. And then I'm going to talk about how Indigenous peoples are, yes indeed, facing innumerable challenges, but at the same time we have a great perseverance, resistance, etc. And we are bringing back our own original ways of helping and teaching and so forth. So that's what it's going to look like. At the very end, I will briefly talk about what I believe is a way forward, whereby we all come together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous social workers and everybody else, actually. All right, so prior to colonization, all Indigenous nations had their own systems of governance, education, and justice, to name just a few, which included teachings and frameworks for family organization, relationships, and childcare. These frameworks were developed, taught, and passed from one generation to the next. Needing and giving help was seen as a natural part of life, and informed support networks were readily available. Reciprocity, which is a very significant value within Indigenous nations, was a way of life, whereby it was very simple. If someone needed help, another person would help them. This would happen because it was understood that at this point, say today, I'm in an okay place, I will be able to support others. Next year, next week, maybe tomorrow, who knows? I'm going to be in a position where I'm going to need support. Therefore, people who are in a place to do so will do so. So it was very much based on reciprocity. Clan systems were also in place within many First Nations communities, and they provided particular responsibilities for clan members. So for example, in both the Anishinaabe Nation, where I reside now, and in the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Fish Clan, for example, were the mediators, philosophers, intellectuals. Bear Clan people were the medicine people and the protectors. There was never any need to leave one's community sorry, I'm going to find my number 2. There was never any need for, okay, I'm good. There was never any need to leave one's community because everything that one needed was right there. One of the things that I'm going to be referencing to back and forth is around children and child care. Whoops, what did I just do now? Oh, okay. Just because child welfare is a big area within social work for all of us. But children were often viewed as gifts from the Creator, and everyone in the community was responsible for raising those children, rather than just the biological parents. And should there be any kind of concern around a child's safety, for example, a circle of care was provided, which never resulted in breaking the child's relationships with the parents or ending the parents' responsibilities or role towards raising their child. And this is really important for us to understand. The relationship was never broken, even if it had to be changed in some way. All right. So now we go into colonization, and we learn, of course, that social work has been very complicit in the role of colonization in the lives of Indigenous peoples. So it has been social workers who have literally attacked Indigenous cultures and the family systems by removing children from their families and their communities. Along with Confederation in 1867, of course, came very deeply embedded forms of colonization. And although social work did begin as a helping profession, this was not the case with Indigenous families. And so this is where the trauma actually begins. In the 1870s, as everyone knows by now, I'm sure, we had the start of the residential schools, which launched decades of separating children from their families and communities. It is now widely known, of course, that there was a great amount of abuse of all forms, spiritual, physical, sexual, psychological, etc. And actually a lot of deaths, both from disease, but also from actual murders. Attacks on Indigenous languages, cultures, traditions, and spirituality resulted in the near cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples across what we refer to as Turtle Island, which is also known as North America. Social workers participated in this genocide by first assisting the removal of children from their communities and bringing them to the residential schools, and later by removing them from their communities and placing them in foster care. So for decades, despite reports that describe the horrific accounts of abuse that happened in the residential schools, such as, for example, a Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. He was a medical inspector to the Department of the Interior and Indian Affairs, as it was called at that time, who investigated these schools. But even though he made these reports, there was no intervention at the time. So a lot of times people will say to me, well, nobody knew that this was happening in Canada, so what could they have done about it? Yeah, people knew. It was in the newspapers a couple of times, right? Of course, Dr. Bryce was not a very popular person, generally speaking, but especially with the federal government. And so nothing much came of that at the time. But we also want to look at how social work activist, educator, and all-around amazing woman, Cyndy Baskin, she says that there is indeed evidence in the form of a joint submission to the Senate and House of Commons in 1946 that the Canadian government, the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Welfare Council, indicating that social workers were well aware of what was happening in the residential schools. That's her research. Okay, where am I now? Probably haven't gone ahead much. Okay. Then, even though the schools started to close in the the schools began in the mid-1900s, the last one closing in 1996 in the province of Saskatchewan. This cultural genocide, of course, continued with the child welfare system and social workers removing children, as I mentioned earlier. This time, however, social workers were not just assisting to remove children. They were actually the ones taking the lead by apprehending Indigenous children and placing them primarily with white families. And this occurred all across Canada, into the United States, into some parts of Europe. When I was a frontline social worker working with an agency called Native Child and Family Services, we actually had a person who was adopted as a baby and went to Germany. And she ended up, as a young adult, figuring out where she actually came from. And so she came back to Canada. She flew into Toronto. We met her at the airport, and then all kinds of things happened for her to be back with her family. But it was one of the strangest things for me to see this very obviously Indigenous woman come off and speak with a German accent. I also saw recently a clip on a man, he looks to be about middle-aged now, who was adopted and sent to New Zealand, and apparently they're making a little documentary around his story, right? So we were literally sent all across the world. A lot of times, these adoptions or foster care did not work out very well. If you don't know the story of Richard Cardinal, it's a really good thing for you to look into. Richard Cardinal was a Métis student in the West, and he had been in 20-something foster homes in his 17 years of life. The final foster home that he was basically in the cellar. It wasn't even a basement, really. It was a cellar that flooded and so on and so forth. And he hung himself in the backyard of that foster home. It's a sad story, but at that point, that's when Indigenous peoples in Canada started to step up and say, enough of this, we need to let people know this is happening, and we need to try to do something about it. So as you know, this mass removal of kids was known as the 60s Scoops, because so many kids were taken away and by the state. So in fact, in the child welfare system, at first there were less than 1% of Indigenous kids in the care of the state, and that jumped to over 30% between the years 1959 and the late 60s. So within a span of about 10 years, we went from 1% to 30% of our kids in care. We know, however, of course, that today we have something called the Millennium Scoop, right? Which is telling us that there are more Indigenous kids in the child welfare system than there have ever been. There are more kids in state care than there were at the height of the residential school. So regardless of what Indigenous and non-Indigenous child welfare has been doing over these decades, it certainly hasn't improved any. We're not doing something right. Okay. All right. So many things, of course, contributed to the 60s Scoop. So, for example, there were legislative changes, notably the Indian Act, the first one coming around in 1876, which made attendance at residential schools mandatory, but later on, it gave child welfare jurisdiction over First Nations children once the schools began to close. So a lack of respect for Indigenous values, such as the rules of extended families and customary care traditions held by most Indigenous nations, led to attacks on Indigenous families, of course, as unfit when they did not conform to Eurocentric family norms. And this is why, right, when we get to the bottom of what has truly happened and continues to happen, this is at the root of it all. Financial incentives for out-of-home child welfare placements for Indigenous kids were created, which often ended up being Indigenous kids being placed with white families that weren't particularly interested in their welfare, but actually were in it to make a few bucks. So there were very little in terms of screening practices, in terms of who were the families that were getting our kids, and this once again led to all kinds of abuse, from things like the exploitation of Indigenous kids as unpaid servants within many homes, to lots and lots of abuse. I don't know if you have heard of this young man a number of years ago. His story was just being taken up by a lot of Indigenous people. His name is Cameron Curley. He's originally from Saskatchewan. He was adopted by a white man in the United States, a single white man in the United States. This was practically unheard of back in those days, right? Families, a mom and a dad, they were the ones who adopted Indigenous kids, right? Or all kids. But in this case, that it wasn't so. So a single white guy was the one who adopted Cameron, and he abused him physically and sexually throughout his entire life. Again, as a young man, I think he was actually about 17 as well. He'd had enough, and he killed his adopted father. A lot of people, it was decided that that was murder, but most of us obviously would say that was self-defense. He was saving himself because nobody would listen to what he was trying to do. Cameron Curley is now in prison for the rest of his life. So, in large part, the impacts of the residential schools and the child welfare system then are often at the root of the serious social problems that are facing Indigenous peoples and communities today. This can include, obviously, poverty, high suicide rates in some communities, mental health challenges, substance misuse for some, and cycles of abuse and violence. In addition, many survivors of these systems are struggling to connect with the worldviews and values of traditional Indigenous cultures that emphasize caring for others, since they haven't experiencing any nurturing themselves. So people are searching. They're searching for their families, their communities, but they're also searching about what are our traditions, what are our culturals, what are our knowledges and beliefs and values. All right. So this over-surveillance of Indigenous peoples by the profession of social work isn't a thing of the past, nor is the trauma that's experienced by so many of us. Social workers continue to participate in the ongoing deterioration of Indigenous communities by removing our most important resource, and that's our kids. As I said earlier, there are more children in the care of the state now than there ever was.
Cindy, I think your
Am I
slide
screwing it up?
yes, slide is one ahead.
I'm one ahead? Okay, sorry. Thank you. And so as you know, that there are more kids in the care of the state than ever before. So it's not without any surprise that many Indigenous people will have a great mistrust and resentment towards social workers. Okay, now I think I can go ahead. This is my daughter and my first grandchild, by the way. I have 5 grandsons,
Oh, wow.
all with the same I know. The last baby a year ago was a boy, and I just had to finally ask, are you gonna keep going until you really have a girl? I said, no, I can't do any more. Oh, goodness. But they're fun, I'll tell you. Okay. So many of us Indigenous folks in Canada, including both in First Nations communities and within urban centers like Toronto, are facing a lot of socioeconomic challenges and difficulties due to the direct impacts of colonization. So this has been acknowledged by Stats Canada. Now, I wrote this before the one just came out. There's a 2017 one that just came out. So I don't have the stats for that because quite frankly, I was just too busy and lazy to cross this out and put in whatever the new one says. But I don't think it's a whole lot differently. I think the messages are very much the same. So for example, in 2006, when they talk about quality of life, of the bottom 100 communities in Canada, 96 were First Nations communities, and 1 was an Inuit community. That's 97 out of 100. 1 First Nations community ranked among the top 100. So, we may see some horrific living standards. I know that you've heard about these things, right? Especially in some northern communities, like Attawapiskat, the Cree Nation in northern Ontario. It got a lot of media. But this, along with decades of trauma, have left many of our communities immobilized and feeling pretty hopeless and helpless. The trauma that's experienced by so many is referred to as historical trauma or collective trauma, as this involves Indigenous peoples as an entire group. Now, you may have heard this referred to as intergenerational trauma. That's the more common or popular term for it. I have a great deal of problem with it, which is why I don't use it, because for me, intergenerational, when you say intergenerational trauma, you know, when the parents pass on these behaviors to their children. Okay, that to me sounds like we're actually blaming the victims, right, for doing so. And that just isn't the way it is. So let's be real about what we're talking about, right? It is historical trauma. It started a long time ago, and it has been passed on to people generation after generation. Nobody, because I like the term historical trauma because nobody has escaped the impacts of colonization. So it doesn't matter if you have not directly experienced abuse. It doesn't matter if you did not attend a residential school. It doesn't matter that you weren't apprehended by child welfare. Every single one of us is impacted by these things, whether you want to look at it as other people in our families, other people in our communities, if you want to look at it as blood memory, which many of us believe in, all of those things are the reasons for this. Okay, now, all right, so we're going to just talk still a bit more on child welfare again. Okay, so those who've experienced adoption into white families, their trauma has been referred to as the split feather syndrome. So now we've got something else new to try to explain what the impacts have been. This is a term that was first created by Carol Locust, and it's used to describe Indigenous children that were adopted into white homes or placed in foster care outside of their communities. So her idea is that these children are now often faced with an impossible situation because what's happened is they've been forced to take on the values of another culture that disrespects their particular belief and value system, and hence these kids experience a lot of difficulty relating to mainstream culture, but also perhaps to their own communities. So like the survivors of the schools, so many who grew up in the child welfare system are struggling with a lot of symptoms like anxiety disorders, depression, substance misuse challenges, and suicides. I wanted to just add in a little bit in there about this sort of part of it. We often have, how do you say it when everything's the same? We paint all First Nations communities as the same, right? So that everybody talks about the horrendous high statistics of young Indigenous people committing suicide. Well, yes, the statistics are indeed horrendous. However, this is not happening all over Canada. I think I talk about this later, or do I? Well, if I do or I don't, it's okay. I'll just mention it now. What the reality is that there are high suicide rates of Indigenous youth in some areas, some First Nations communities, right? Some cities, some towns, etc., etc. It's not all over Canada. And the one thing that we know now, right, is that the more self-governance, control that a First Nations community has, the healthier it is, including suicide rates. So we even have some communities that have a considerable amount of self-governance, and they have zero youth suicides. See, there's your evidence, right? Everybody wants evidence-based research and all this stuff. Well, there it is. It's very clear. Get out of our lives, let us have control over our own stuff, and we'll probably be okay over the long term. So, what is it, though, about this focus on removing kids? Should I be switching it now? I think. Okay. Why is there such a emphasis on removing kids from their families? So part of it will indeed connect to sets of values, whereby mainstream child welfare sees the best interests of the child as being the most important thing. And in Indigenous worldviews, the emphasis is going to be more on the collective, right? The family. Seeing the child not being separate from the family and the community. But mainstream child welfare certainly separates these two. So often what we have is very biased values that are used to assess whether or not Indigenous families can care for their kids. Another highly significant reason for so many apprehensions of Indigenous children is called neglect by the state. Again, contrary to what a lot of people think, the majority of our children are not in care because of abuse in their own families and communities. It's actually that they have been, the word neglect has been tied onto the families, and that's why the kids are in care. This is very different from mainstream child welfare apprehensions, where the most of the apprehensions are due to child abuse. So ours is neglect, not child abuse. But of course, what is called neglect by the child welfare system is simply poverty. Right? So a family and a community are not able, if they don't have it, to give their children what they don't have. You can't give your kids what you don't have. Right? So the idea is that we do something about poverty, that will lead a great deal into helping out our children and not having to see this happen so much. In addition, child welfare has to take some responsibility for the ongoing structural factors when adoptions break down, for example, as they often do. As a matter of fact, about 85% tend to be viewed by child welfare as personality problems. So what they're saying is that when it doesn't work out between a white family and an Indigenous kid, then it's because there's a personality conflict between the caregivers and the kids. Okay? The logic here is that it's poor matching between the Indigenous child and the adoptive family, And so this causes stress between the two and leads to a breakdown of the relationship. So child welfare often sees such relationship breakdowns as more significant than any other systemic problems. The obvious flaw with this theory is that the problem is the reasoning that the problem of not knowing ahead of time whether one's personality will conflict with the Indigenous child when they are adopted as toddlers, babies, or even at birth. So how is one to know whether or not their personality is going to conflict with the child's 10 years from now when you've taken them into care as babies? Obviously, this is an excuse that holds no water, but they're trying to hold on to it anyway. Okay, here we are, I think. Okay. Now, basically just to, it's kind of to sum that up, but also to start moving into something else. But regardless of what we seem to be looking at, if it's child welfare or health or counseling, et cetera, the literature based on research by Indigenous scholars is consistent about what isn't working and what needs to be done. The main problem when non-Indigenous social workers work with Indigenous peoples is that they overlook the Indigenous person's beliefs and values and instead use approaches to social work that they assume to be universal. You was talking about universal, and that comes up a whole lot when we talk about social work with a lot of people, right? International social work, for example. So the role that worldviews and cultures play in the identification of problems, their causes and possible solutions are disregarded. So even though people can be aware of the impacts of colonization on our children and our families, that's not enough. It's like you got to learn about colonization. You need to learn about the impacts of colonization, but then you need to be able to move on to what do you do about this? How do you move forward? Like I said earlier, obviously, it's about having control of our own services, etc. Right? So these approaches within mainstream social work might not fit with Indigenous worldviews due to looking at the individual rather than looking at a community-based focus. A lot of talk therapy instead of holistic methods. Strict professional boundaries rather than more flexible ones. Ignoring spirituality instead of seeing it as a strength. Importantly, a focus on an individual deficit discourse ignores, of course, the realities of racism and the impacts of colonization. Whereas health promotion that involves a politicized identity and resistance against colonial practices have been linked to overall positive health for Indigenous youth. So when our youth are out there doing hip-hop music and calling out the Canadian government and so on, they're doing better, right? So it's really important that we encourage them to continue doing these kinds of things. Research also tells us that a stronger cultural identity helps reduce depression, suicide, drug misuse, and emotional stress in adolescents and youth, and culture, family, and community are able to shape the one's identity in positive ways. Now, there's a lot of talk over many, many years, including when I was doing my social work education, about phrases that are like cultural competency, cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness, all these kinds of things. And unfortunately, this kind of training still exists, I see, in a lot of the helping professions, not just social work, right? So basically, I have a huge problem with anything that's referred to in that kind of a way, because when you say cultural competency, for example, what culture are you talking about? That implies that all Indigenous peoples everywhere on the planet have the same culture. Right? Obviously, we do not, right? There are hundreds of cultures just in this part of the world, Canada part of the world, and each of those cultures carry their own languages, their own practices, their own belief systems, and so on and so forth. So yeah, going to a one-day training on cultural competency and getting a certificate that you can put up on your wall is absolutely useless, and it's very misleading, right? So there's no such thing as Aboriginal culture. You wouldn't believe how many papers I have to because people keep doing that, right? You always got to put an S on the end of that, right? Where I see the very significant commonalities amongst us would be more like in our foundation, our value base. And that's what I refer to when I'm talking about knowledges and worldviews. I'm meaning that foundation, right? So the foundation has the set, a very similar set of values, like the stuff I was talking about around children and families. That's pretty common amongst all of us, right? But how we put these things into practice is going to be different from one nation to the other, from one community to another, whether you're in a First Nation community, whether in an urban center, all different then. So we don't look, walk, and talk the same. There's a difference. Cultural safety, however, I'm not sure that I particularly like that term either. My opinion on that one, I guess, is still kind of hovering somewhere, but it is an emerging model that's coming into social work a little bit, and it is promising because it does take up all of those concerns that I mentioned, but also emphasizes that safe services can only be defined by those who are receiving them. So cultural safety is really what is the person you're working with think safety is. The other thing that I think is really important is that this is a theory that was created by a Maori nurse in New Zealand. She has passed away, but knowing that it's coming from someone who really understands this and is part of the community and so on and so forth makes it much more real, much more true, I guess, right? This has, since she came up with it, been supported by other researchers who have found in several instances that narratives based on stories of resistance and resilience consistently make reference to values and beliefs and draw on a collective history and teachings. So, as these researchers say, I have a quote from someone, many communities are strengthening individual and collective agency through political activism, empowerment, and reconciliation. Active engagement or success in political organizations, such as land claims or the search for other forms of recognition of rights and identity, not only brings material benefits, but also enhances collective and individual self-esteem and is associated with better mental health. Collective efficacy strengthens individual efficacy and so makes individuals feel more capable of addressing their own needs. So, regardless of where Indigenous people might be, they all experience their own unique challenges regarding the delivery of social services. Those in urban centers, for instance, are a great mix of people from diverse First Nations. Is Fredericton's not called an urban center, is it? It is? Okay. So that's probably not the case here. But if we're looking at huge cities like Toronto, that is a very big mix. In Toronto and other large cities, we have many diverse nations who have their own kind of protocols and practices and so on and so forth. Also, people are on a continuum, in terms of how they see themselves and their identities. So there are people who regularly practice their traditional beliefs, but then there are those who do not practice them at all. And some Indigenous people belong to various religious dominations, and others are atheists, right? So the message in this is we don't assume, right? We don't assume. We remember cultural safety, and we make sure that the person we're working with gets to tell us where they are on this continuum. The agencies then in urban centers are have to service this great diverse number of Indigenous peoples in multiple areas. So social service agencies, I find, in urban centers are often going to be covering almost everything. So health, advocacy, trauma counseling, and education. All of these things will be happening under one roof. Again, because there's no way that we can provide culturally appropriate services to every different group, what has emerged are various pan-Indigenous approaches that are applied to all or a mix of cultural practices from the local First Nations communities surrounding the urban center. So this is another quote. Basically, the message is you kind of like figure out whose territory surrounds you, whose land are you actually sitting on, and take it from their direction. But as you can see, they're still throwing in this whole thing about culture that doesn't sit well with me, but that's okay. I'm not the boss of it all yet. So regardless of the person, the situation, and the approach, the focus is on centering the service user and building a relationship with that person. This needs to be done this is done within Indigenous services, but it also needs to be done in mainstream services. So relationship building is the very first and most important thing. Funding for social services is always an ongoing issue. In many ways for Indigenous peoples living both on reserve and off reserve. So for those living in cities again, the amount of funding for services has not kept up with the growth of Indigenous peoples living in them. I'm sure you know that. This is the standard for social services everywhere, right? But it's even harsher for what's offered to Indigenous peoples. And many agencies have several different funding sources with different sets of accountability and requirements, so creating a huge administrative burden on already stretched service providers. Once again, I think if you go to Indigenous agencies, this is what you will often see. In addition, many agencies are left uncertain as to whether or not their services will continue or if service providers will have jobs when the time-limited projects are completed. So everything is so very precarious. People are so worried about whether funding is going to continue or not, and that really gets in the way. It's so super stressed out. So yeah, how do agencies make long-term plans under these kinds of conditions that are very limiting? The other thing that's important with that is that Indigenous peoples who already live in urban centers are the fastest growing demographic in Canadian society. So more and more Indigenous peoples are moving to urban centers. So over 50%, I think it's 54% about right now, is Indigenous people living in cities. So again, if that's the case, you can see how the funding and the services are not keeping up, right, to what is needed in the cities. And our population is very young. So again, another over 50% of our population is under the age of 25 years old. And this is critical to the future of this country, and the government knows this. The government knows that the average mainstream population is aging, right? So basically, this is what the future looks like. A whole bunch of old white people, sorry for saying it that way, and a whole bunch of young Indigenous people. So if you're afraid, you should be. Remember, a lot of them are becoming more politicized than my generation. I look at my son and I go, whoa, good luck, world. Anyhow, so yes, things are really going in a very different way in terms of what the population looks like. Okay, I think it's another one there. Fastest, yep, all right. One of the really big challenges, I guess, that apply to both First Nations communities and urban centers is the lack of qualified Indigenous peoples to deliver the services and run the agencies, right? Another involves how overworked and stressed everybody is. Also being trained in a social work academic program is rapidly becoming an expectation for Indigenous helpers. So I know a lot of Indigenous social workers across Canada who've been doing social work-ish work. They've been doing helping work for many, many, many years, but they don't have the piece of paper. So basically what's happening is funders and their agencies or boards of directors are saying, you guys have got to go get your BSWs, etc., or we won't be able to keep you, right? So a lot of Indigenous people are figuring out how in the heck they're going to be able to go back to school and get those degrees so that they can continue to work. I'm an educator, like so many others in the room, so obviously I think it's great that Indigenous peoples return to school or continue on with school or what have you, but I also believe that that is a very small piece of what being a helper is all about. So, in a lot of these cases, it's the helpers, they have tons of lived experience, and they have a lot of things in common with the people that they're servicing, and lots of years as frontline workers. But these helpers are not necessarily the ones that have BSWs and the MSWs after their names. These are the helpers that are elders, traditional teachers, and medicine people, all of who are doing exceptional work within Indigenous communities and urban centers, but we often don't acknowledge them or even realize that they're doing the work. For these and other Indigenous peoples, there are many, including lack of funds, having to leave home, family responsibilities, and an educational system that offers little relevant learning or knowledge that speaks to them and their worldviews and experiences. So it's very difficult sometimes for Indigenous peoples to go back to school, not just because of all of the usual barriers that some people would have, but also because of all of this. Having done all but my PhD in mainstream social work programs, where I was the only Indigenous person in my courses, and Indigenous people were not spoken of except for, I remember this very well when I took a course on how to work with people with substance misuse challenges. That's when Indigenous people came in. And that was the only time that anything was said. So my experience at school was quite horrific. It was just simply put your head down, do the work, and get out of here. My PhD experience was completely different though. So that was a good one. So these are barriers that have to be eliminated, or they must at least be lessened in order for a critical mass of Indigenous people to access university education. And so now, as I'm sure you've all noticed, there's this big rush to hire all kinds of Indigenous people as faculty members in all kinds of different areas across the country. That is a wonderful thing in a lot of ways, but how are such hires going to be supported in getting the education that is required of them and do the work at the same time? My experience is really interesting. I started at Ryerson when I was still a frontline practitioner as a sessional instructor. So they wanted an elective course and something to do with social work with Aboriginal peoples. So I ended up getting that position. I developed a course and I taught it for a number of years. And then in 2001, they had a faculty opening and they decided that they really needed to have a permanent tenure track Indigenous person who could come in and teach and help them to infuse Indigenous content to the program, et cetera, et cetera. So anyhow, I ended up applying for that job, and I got it. But the thing is that when I got hired, I had an MSW. I had no intentions of ever going to do a PhD. I hadn't even thought about it. And so the deal with me was that I had to sign a contract saying that I would have my PhD in 4 years. And if I didn't, I was out the door. So Cyndy applies to OISE, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, the only place I wanted to go to, because remember, I hated school, and got accepted, thank goodness, something was looking after me. I got accepted, it was a great experience, except, think about it, I was doing a PhD program full-time. I was working in the School of Social Work full-time, right? I had never worked anywhere but First Nations communities and grassroots agencies, you know, where everybody loves each other, at least we did in those days. That's not anything I'm going to say anything more about there. Right, and it's very supported and so on, so I come into this huge institution and it's like I'm alone in my office and it's like very isolated and like where's all the people that are supposed to be helping me? I don't know. The rules of the place are absolutely ridiculous. Most of them I don't know 16 years later and I couldn't care less. Right? Only Indigenous hire in the entire university. I was the very first Indigenous person to be hired at Ryerson. So there's no peeps there for me, right? None at all. And to top it all off, my son was, I have older kids and then I have a younger kid. That's why you hear me say different things, right? So the youngest one is the one I'm about to say. He was 3 years old when I started. All right, so you got the picture? Uh-huh. 4 years later, I had my PhD, I had tenure, and I had promotion to associate director. And it almost killed me. Everybody wants to know how to do it. I don't know how I did it. But I tell you, when I finally got to that 6-year mark and I went on my first sabbatical, I spent the first half of it sick as hell. Right? I just held on to it until I could get her done. And then it all kind of came over. So this is the kind of thing that is going to be happening all over the country. So I want to be like the poster person for how you do not bring Indigenous faculty into universities, right? You've got to do a hell of a lot better than that. My goodness. Okay. So, again, just getting back to Indigenous worldviews, it's our elders, our knowledge keepers, etc., who carry the information that we need, and in most cases, these are the people that are respected and revered within our communities. So you have a very huge role in education and in the area of health. So it's kind of mind-boggling for a lot of us that we don't have more of these folks in the educational system. So policymakers and funders don't agree with this though, so we're not always able to provide the actual services that people want and need. So if people are coming to an agency and they say, well, I want to see a healer, I want to see an elder, and we don't have access to any of these people, then we're not doing the cultural safety thing, right? Because we're not adhering to the needs that people are asking us for. Other challenges that show up in the literature are also about the depth of needs that service users might have, right? So because of the impacts of colonization, you can just imagine how many challenges that people may be facing when they eventually make it into a social services agency. Most of the time, they're there because they're being told to be there too, right? Which is how it usually happens. But that's one thing. The other thing is vicarious trauma, which is carried in, by many of us in the helping professions working with Indigenous peoples. That's because what I think happens is a lot of people who have had great difficulties and challenges and trauma in their life end up going into a helping profession. And we see this a lot. I don't think I know any Indigenous social workers that don't have a history of all this stuff that I'm talking about as well. And so that can be very difficult for them, and often there just isn't enough support within the agencies. And then of course, the failure to address structural issues is always going to be a barrier regardless of what individual social workers will do. Another thing that I think is important is often, I mentioned earlier about relationships. So often we will have maybe a different sort of look at what boundaries are, what self-disclosure is about, et cetera, right? So what mainstream folks think of as maintaining healthy boundaries when you are a service provider can be very challenging for Indigenous peoples, especially if you're living in your own community, right? So you're like, I remember you when you were, I know this, and I remember all the things you did when you were 16 years old, and you can get a lot of that, trust me. But another quote here is, the staff characteristic of being both a community member and a service provider is rooted in cultural ways of helping and essential to make service relevant, appropriate, and effective. Remember what I said about reciprocity at the beginning and relationship building, right? That's what this is referring to. This is our greatest strength, but it also poses some important challenges for identifying the issues and dealing with difficulties that arise. Next. Okay, so some of these challenges are written about by a number of Indigenous scholars. They talk about where you're working in your own community, therefore you have multiple relationships with people that you're working with, and that service users could be a combination of our friends, relatives, relatives of friends, elders, healers, or other helpers. This Indigenous scholar also goes on to say, I am working at home. The multi-layered relationships are a reality, and there is no such thing as objectivity or anonymity, because everyone knows where you live and who you are. In the evenings or on weekends, I would have people knock on my door, and I would serve them tea and talk about whatever was on their mind. Sometimes people would arrive on my doorstep late at night seeking support, a drive home, or a safe place to sleep. People trusted me because I belonged there. Sometimes, though, it was difficult to find a balance and establish healthy boundaries for myself and family. So if any of you are working in your own communities, then you would probably agree that this is quite the challenge, right? And how do we figure this out? Because we aren't just the service provider, there's so many other things, right? And a lot of times they have a rule, like you can't work with anybody that you're related to. Well, if you're from a small community and you're there, you could be related to almost everybody, right? So these kinds of rules and boundaries and things don't fit for us, right? And I would say that they don't fit for a lot of other people, right? What about if you're living in a tiny town somewhere, right? It may be similar things. So every Indigenous community including those in urban centers, have experienced multiple losses and inequitable treatment by governments and mainstream society in general. So this experience can be seen as pretty much universal to all Indigenous communities because of the belief that every individual is connected again to both family and community. And if an injustice happens to one, then it happens to all. So everybody becomes impacted by it. For, as an example, you may have students in your classes and there is a death of a community member in their home community. And even though they're not blood related to that person, they still, right, will need to go home. So they may like have to disappear for a couple of weeks, go back home and participate in the ceremonies and everything that happens when someone passes on, right? And then those of us in the academy are, oh, how are you related to that person? Well, we're not biologically related, and then they're kind of, well, why would you be going for 2 weeks to do blah, blah, blah? Keeping in mind we're in a society where, you know, what do you get, 3 days off from work if your mom dies or something? Like, all right, everybody thinks that's ridiculous, right? Okay. Good. Okay, so that can happen often. But we're often still, and I shouldn't say flat, and we're often still concentrating on the symptoms rather than the causes of those symptoms. And further research, of course, by Indigenous people is needed because we need more understanding of the experiences of Indigenous social workers and other helpers in order to advocate for positive change at community and structural levels. So as we're not just educators and we're not just service providers, but we're also activists and advocates trying really hard to have the people that we recognize in our communities, etc., as being equally recognized within the academy, etc. Okay, now we're on, oops, sorry, I did that one already. Okay. So now a little bit about the future. And so very quickly in terms of theories, like what sort of, is there an Indigenous theory kind of thing? There are theories such as anti-colonialism or post-colonialism that are built on resistance against colonial forces which are imposed on people who live within a colonized state. So anti-colonialism or post-colonialism is about us resisting the so-called universal theories and ideologies that get taught in schools of social work as well as elsewhere. So what we're wanting to be looking at this is that anti-colonialism is not just about Indigenous people learning about that theory, it's also about everybody else learning about that theory. And just as truth and reconciliation are a Canadian issue rather than only an Indigenous one, so are colonization and decolonization. Right? So theories such as anti-oppression, which is very popular, I think it's getting to be in some programs, is good, of course, because of what it's about, but it doesn't go far enough. So it doesn't include us, and it doesn't tell us like, okay, so we know all this awful stuff, what are we going to do now, right? The idea is we've got to do something, we can't even learn about it. So anti-colonialism calls on all of us to challenge, question, and recognize the ongoing nature of colonialism. I don't believe that colonialism is done, it's still happening. It's a practice of educating, undoing, and resisting colonial practices, which are of course embedded in all of our work structures, including the profession of social work. So implementing an anti-colonial stance is about acknowledging the strengths and contributions of Indigenous peoples, and that's why I think it's so important. It's also a theory that comes from Indigenous people. So when I was doing my PhD, that's the theory that I used in my work. And the first scholars that I found that were writing about this were scholars, Indigenous scholars from the continent of Africa. So they were my theoretical folks when I was writing my PhD. Okay, so one of the things we need to do is something that they call decolonizing by indigenizing. People are talking about this in a lot of different ways in the academy, and again, it's one of those things that's floating around that I'm not sure exactly what that means to me, what I think it's going to look like. I'm not there yet. I'm not sure. But basically, it's about privileging Indigenous voices in their approaches and practices to helping. That much I know, but it needs to be taught. It also means that we ensure Indigenous peoples occupy leadership roles in the direct development of curriculum in schools of social work that represents their knowledges and how those knowledges will be taught. So we need those people to come into the university at many different levels and doing many different things, but it can't be tokenized, and it has to come with a great deal of support if we really want this to happen. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples need to be at the forefront of social service agencies and programming that is developed, which is based on their worldviews and approaches to helping. So when Indigenous students are on programs, we need to be thinking that this is what they are probably there to try to learn, and how do we make that happen? Okay, so by creating space for Indigenous approaches to social work, and by recognizing their effectiveness and the healing that they foster, it can be that, and this is another quote, Aboriginal communities, when provided with adequate supports, develop the most sustainable socio-economic improvements for children. That's basically what I've been saying so far throughout this presentation. That's another quote from Cyndy Baskin. In addition, Indigenous approaches, which utilize tools such as circle work and community engagement, and involves elders, traditional teachers, knowledge keepers, etc., have proven to be helpful social work practice in many Indigenous communities. So it's not like we don't know this, right? We already know this. So we know what needs to be done. The profession, however, as you know, hasn't done the greatest job for us thus far. And yet there are so many opportunities, right? And social work can actually be a leader in decolonization processes because it's involved in the lives of so many Indigenous peoples, right? When you're so involved with a population of people, think about how much you can learn from them if you want to. Some non-Indigenous social work educators and practitioners, I think, have already begun this journey of trying to decolonize their minds and practices. And these are the people that we call allies. I don't know how far any of us can go in terms of decolonizing our minds, but I think that there are many people that are certainly struggling and trying really hard to do so. In social work, there's been somewhat of a shift away from conventional approaches that have started to look at how we can work with Indigenous peoples as well as other marginalized groups. And this, of course, is something that requires critical reflexivity. It takes up how mainstream values and beliefs are viewed as superior to all others. The framework is also about social workers sharing their power with service users, which is beginning to be recognized as good social work practice. Right? So there are, again, Indigenous people who are doing the research and publishing their work, and they're able to show us that these things are helping. It also means that for non-Indigenous peoples, you need to stand in solidarity with us. So you're either with us or you're against us, I'm afraid. And silence means against us, right? Silence is simplicity. A lot of people, including some of my colleagues, are like, just want to put my head down and do the work. Well, don't talk to me then. No, I'm kidding. Sort of. So what does that mean, though, when we stand in solidarity with another group of people? It means that letting go of this expert stance is very important. Let go of the neutral observer position, because there's no such thing, and become a constant learner. That's how you can support us and in making the best decisions for our communities. But always keep in mind that that's support, right? We are the ones who need to do it. All right. Another person that I'm going to quote is actually Anne Bishop, who's a Maritimer. So she's written that important piece, foundational piece on how to be an ally. And she emphasizes that social workers mustn't fall into this trap of over-personalizing their responsibilities, which can lead to internalizing feelings of guilt. Guilt is a useless emotion in the work of becoming an ally, as it disempowers people, rendering them unable to do the needed work. In understanding their role in oppression, social workers need to view it through a structural lens whereby they see themselves as part of a collective where systemic oppression and marginalization are produced and maintained. So if our allies see their roles and responsibilities as doing something about the ongoing impacts of colonization, then they will be learning what we're hoping they will. It's really important and unacceptable that it be Indigenous peoples be the only ones to have to do this. So we need you to teach your own people, rather than us having to teach everybody all the time, over and over again. I myself am, quite frankly, pretty close done to doing a lot of talks and teachings about colonization and its impacts, because I tell you, it doesn't matter how many times I do it, I'm still re-traumatized because we're talking about me, my family, etc., etc. I don't want to do it anymore. I think my next article is going to be something about decolonization doesn't mean that I have to bleed all over you, right? And I truly mean that. My job as a teacher is to teach about Indigenous knowledges and worldviews and values, and how I believe that a lot of that is applicable to all peoples of the world. That's what I want to do. I don't want to talk about the other stuff anymore. But when it comes to practice, most of the literature will talk about how relationships between Indigenous and mainstream educators and social services workers and social workers really need to be strengthened. And again, I know you'll always hear me use that word relationship because it is so critically important. So this is important in both urban centers and in institutions and First Nations communities. What we need are partnerships and processes that emphasize perhaps what is referred to as the best work of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. So this society, this is Cyndy Baskin's work again, by the way. You can tell I really like her. So she says, this society has developed a process for reconciliation in the child welfare system that presents an opportunity for the social work profession to engage with First Nations communities in a meaningful and effective way. The first phase is in the reconciliation process involves truth-telling or open exchanges about the history of child welfare. This process involves the participation of both those affected by the child welfare system as well as those involved in administering its policies. The profession of social work must make itself accountable to the history of harm that it has perpetuated as a first step in moving forward to create a system based on social justice and inclusive Indigenous values, cultures, and knowledges. So She's telling us this is what needs to happen, and this is what she's seen as being successful, or what works when she works with people. In addition to these recommendations, there are also aspects, I believe, of Indigenous worldviews that can be implemented for all people of the world. And that's basically how I teach my courses. In privileging Indigenous knowledges as having relevance for everyone, we need to first acknowledge that the problems of the world are not going to be solved merely by our professional expertise. It just isn't happening that way. So, for example, areas such as Indigenous peoples' ways of looking at things in a holistic way, right? We've been doing that since the beginning of time, but now it's only recently that some Western methods are making space for incorporating such approaches as a result of their being proven to improve good health. So a holistic approach can apply to all kinds of areas, including what's viewed as best for the child in the context of that child's family and community, implementing justice in ways that are healing rather than punishing, focusing on community wellness rather than applying it only to individuals, and seeing strengths in those who come to us for assistance. So at this point in time, I've also noticed that a lot of people around the world are seeking to incorporate spirituality into their lives. And this is an area where I believe Indigenous peoples have a great deal to offer. So no helping profession, in my opinion, can be whole without including the spiritual dimension. So I think if practitioners and educators are ignoring spirituality, then they're not fully responding to the needs of the people that who come to them for services or come to them for schooling. For many, spirituality is actually the most powerful source of strength, right? Because so many of us who choose to go on operate on some form of faith. A spiritual value or belief can be a powerful resource in a person's life that can be used in problem solving, coping, trauma recovery, etc. I think it can be implemented within all areas of social work, actually. I don't think we should regulate spirituality to only concerns about death and dying, because I think that's often where we go. But spirituality is actually about living. So we need to try to do that. The move towards understanding individual problems as part of a collective experience honors the impacts of colonization, and it moves away from judgment, pathologizing, and blaming those who are struggling. And this still happens a lot, especially if we're doing it from an individualistic look. We have to involve all these other people and collaborate with helpers in communities in many different ways. We need to make sure we're building capacity, because all of these things will lead to self-determination. So it seems that the way forward is to bring relevant Indigenous research to social workers and policymakers to assist in decision-making processes regarding us and our communities. We also need to provide opportunities for partnerships, more partnerships between practitioners and academics. I find with Indigenous social services agencies is that they're so overworked and tired and stressed out that research is like not even on their radar, right? But we know how to do research, so we can be a valuable resource and can help them do a great deal of work without them having to take it on. And they got so much. They got so much information that really should be out there. In this way, both academics and practitioners could work together and come up with the knowledge and make it available, which is important as well. Now, think I've said most of that part, so I'm not going to bore you with repeating things. So, in closing, just a couple of little things. One of them is my kind of hopes for the future. I am a hopeful, optimistic kind of person because I feel like that's how I must live my life, or it would have killed me by now. So I think it's important for us to celebrate the successes of the movements forward, even though they may seem very small in the midst of a great deal of challenges. So I'm kind of like that. It's kind of funny because in the past, rarely have non-Indigenous people who don't know me recognize me as an Indigenous person, because I, like so many others, of course, don't look like an Indigenous person. So they say, like, what I'm supposed to look like according to them. When I ask them, now, what am I supposed to look like? They kind of go, oh, anyhow. But something very interesting has started to happen, and it just has been literally like months. But I noticed that people are really seriously looking at my tattoos, which you can't see because they're ears. But I really noticed that people were looking at them. And many of those people actually decide to comment. And typically what they say is, they ask me if my tattoos are native. Are those native tattoos? And when I say yeah, they further comment about how native tattoos have very distinct looks. And other observant people actually recognize that the fish on my arm is a salmon, and that's my clan. And others actually ask me what my nation is, rather than telling me I don't look native. So I don't really know what this is all about, but it's happened so often that it's something that I thought I'd mention here, and that I think I'm going to add into something I write at some point. But I hope that maybe it's that some Canadians are actually taking the time to educate themselves about Indigenous peoples based on the prevalence of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings, recommendations, and calls to action, I think. However, the spiritual part of me likes to think that this is a shift in the gaze of non-Indigenous people could be a sign that we are on the brink of positive change for everybody. And that's my optimism, and that's how I will finish for today. Thank you so much for listening.